Thousands of Venezuelans have rallied in Caracas to commemorate the 30th anniversary of the Caracazo. Caracazo is the name given to a series of protests and riots that began on February 27, 1989. Hundreds of people were killed by security forces working for the government of Carlos Andrés Pérez. The victims were protesting austerity measures and price hikes imposed by the neoliberal government. 30 years to the day, Venezuelans gathered to remember the historical event.
30 years ago, the Venezuelan people from Guarena, from Petares, made their voices be heard by taking to the streets. They demanded freedom. They called for imperialism and neoliberalism to stop running over them. Our people took to the streets 30 years ago, and they have never returned home. They have kept fighting for their freedom and sovereignty. To imperialist powers, I say, I do not know who you have here to rule Venezuela in the case of your coup succeeds, because you will face Venezuelans protesting and fighting every single day in the streets for a constitution to be victorious.
And Venezuela's Foreign Minister Jorge Arreaza has provided the UN with photo evidence of the aggressive opposition attacks at the border with Colombia. Addressing the United Nations Human Rights Council in Geneva, Arreaza pointed out that some people used the logo of the International Red Cross without permission. The Foreign Minister also discussed how the U.S. sanctions imposed on Venezuela have had a serious impact on the people.
And also, the expert Idris Yasairi discussed about the possible sanctions, and he has said the sanctions lead towards there to be few medicine. It is not the answer to Venezuela. The expert said, I am worried to be able to hear that the reports that these sanctions are geared towards changing the government. Military economic coercion should never be used in order to try to seek a regime change in a sovereign state. And he keeps on saying that the use of sanctions on external powers in order to get rid of a democratically elected nation is against all international norms.
And after the UN meeting, Arreaza met with Peter Maurer, president of the International Red Cross Committee. The meeting was held to reinforce cooperation between them. Arreaza also offered details about last week's violence at the border, which was stoked by the Colombian government. Red Cross refused to participate, saying the aid was being used for political purposes.
So we've been in touch
Venezuela's opposition lawmaker Juan Guaidó is headed to Brazil on Thursday to meet the country's far-right president Jair Bolsonaro. This comes as the opposition and their allies plan their next move, following their failed humanitarian aid stunt on the border last weekend. Earlier this week, Guaidó met with U.S. Vice President Mike Pence in Colombia, as Pence announced new sanctions against the Venezuelan government. Earlier, a fire has been reported inside the Venezuelan port of La Guaira, located in the northern state of Vargas. According to local reports, the fire took place in warehouses where boxes of food from the Venezuelan Food Distribution Committees are stored. Firefighters used 6 tanks of water to control the fire. The cause of the fire is still unknown. Now to the Caribbean. Caricom nations are wrapping up a 2-day summit in St. Kitts and Nevis. Leaders have discussed the unfolding political situation in Venezuela, Haiti, and Guyana, as well as the Caribbean single market and economy. Caricom members are expected to ratify their support for the Montevideo mechanism that seeks dialogue and a peaceful solution in Venezuela. Our correspondent Laura Prada was able to speak with Prime Minister of Antigua and Barbuda, Gaston Brown.
Yeah, we dealt with a number of issues affecting the Caribbean region, Caricom more specifically. Issues to include transportation. We also looked at the whole issue of security within the region and the Caricom single market and economy to make sure that we get to the stage where we have a fully operational single market and economy. I would say that we have made significant progress on the issues. We also looked at other regional issues, disputes between Guatemala and Belize, Guyana and Venezuela, and even the issue involving the situation in Venezuela, the political situation in Venezuela. Caricom will be issuing a statement. In essence, we continue to stand on the international principles of non-interference and certainly respecting the sovereignty of the people of Venezuela, and for the Venezuelans to resolve the issues on their own, to come up with their own Venezuelan accord, and that there should be no form of military intervention in Venezuela. So we're hoping that the parties concerned will utilize their best efforts to come to the table, to talk, to use diplomacy and dialogue in resolving this issue.
And about Haiti, because it's one of Caricom members, what is the position?
Well, we're also hoping too that the situation there would stabilize. We want this hemisphere to be maintained as a hemisphere of peace. And I would go back to Venezuela. We're very concerned about the threats of intervention in Venezuela. We think that should be avoided at all costs, that this hemisphere should be maintained as a zone of peace. And the Caricom, would have issued a statement to that effect today. It will be published a little later in the day. And we just want to ensure that the parties come together. We're also very concerned about the issue of the sanctions. The fact that the sanctions would have exacerbated the situation in Venezuela. Caricom did not go as far as speaking extensively about the sanctions, but I can certainly say in the case of Antigua and Barbuda, as far as we're concerned, the sanctions are obviously creating hardships to the people of Venezuela. And we are hoping that the countries so concerned will revisit the impact of those sanctions, that they're literally, plunging innocent people in Venezuela into poverty. And we do not know that it is acceptable to seize Venezuela's billions of dollars and then to offer them a few $1 million in aid. That seems to be an unsustainable position. And whereas we believe that there should be dialogue and that there should be diplomacy in resolving the issues, I believe that there is a need to review the sanctions and to make sure that there's no suffering inflicted on the innocent people of Venezuela.
Antigua is also, besides being a Caricom active member, it's ALBA
Correct.
and Petrocaribe. For your country also, this situation with Venezuela, how affects in that relation?
It has. Venezuela has assisted countries in the Caribbean with petrol on credit over 25 years, very easy terms, and they would have allowed for the funding of certain social programs within our respective countries. So those programs, for the most part, would have been jeopardized. And even the fiscal space that countries would have had from the credit that they received from Venezuela would have been impacted as well. So in essence, it's a situation in which we have a vested interest, and we're just hoping that the issues will be resolved as soon as possible and that we can have peace and tranquility in Venezuela.
We'll be back very soon. Stay with us. The Trinidad and Tobago-based Movement for Social Justice recently held protests pleading with the U.S. to lift the sanctions that they imposed on Venezuela. We're joined live now by the group's leader, David Abdullah. David, thank you so much for joining us.
Good afternoon, and thank you very much for having me. Yes, on Monday, we had first a solidarity press conference outside the Venezuelan embassy. It was organized by the Movement for Social Justice, which is a progressive political party here in Trinidad and Tobago. And we were joined by many trade unions in Trinidad and Tobago. So we had the Oilfields Workers Trade Union, the Banking, Insurance and General Workers Union, Postal Workers Union, Communication Workers Union, the Steel Workers Union, the Trinidad and Tobago Farmers Union, and a number of solidarity organizations, the Bolivarian Solidarity Organization and the Trinidad and Tobago Friends of Cuba. So it was very much a national activity. The leaders of these organizations were all present. And from the Venezuelan embassy, we walked to the US embassy and demanded an end to sanctions and also hands off Venezuela, and also that there must be no military intervention in Venezuela. Next door to the U.S. Embassy is the Office of the European Union, and so we also made those same demands outside of the European Union, communicating that mass organizations, progressive mass organizations in Trinidad and Tobago, progressive political parties, are opposed to sanctions because that is causing more of a problem in Venezuela with respect to food shortages and medicine and so on. The sanctions is what is really hurting the people of Venezuela. And it is hypocritical for the US government of Trump and others to be talking about humanitarian assistance when much more money has been seized in US banks, in European banks and so on, and through the sanctions, which are illegal and illegitimate.
Now, David, what are your thoughts on the USA offering so-called humanitarian aid to Venezuela?
It really is hypocritical because if the United States government is genuinely concerned about the well-being of the Venezuelan people, they would remove the sanctions. Because if the sanctions are removed, then the Venezuelan government of President Maduro will be able to have access to money, which is Venezuelan money, in US banks and so on, to be able to buy food and medicines. In addition, any humanitarian assistance should be done through international agencies like the United Nations, and not in an attempt to politicize it by driving trucks across borders, because that, of course, is then creating a whole security problem of violating a country's national borders. Mr. Trump would not allow a caravan of people to enter the United States. He wants to build a wall, yet he will want to send people and trucks and so on across the border of a sovereign state, namely Venezuela. That is wrong. It is hypocritical, and we call it out for what it is, a pretext towards a military intervention.
David, we thank you so much for your time and your input for Telesur English.
Thank you very much. Hands off Venezuela.
We have us speaking with David Abdullah from Trinidad and Tobago. More news now. A social project in El Salvador provides education, health, and social activities for young people who are exposed to street violence.
Young people from the Cangrejera municipality put together a samba percussion ensemble, also known as Batucada. They are part of the Youth in Action initiative that looks to include other kids in education matters such as the acknowledgement of human rights and youth empowerment.
I don't know what would have happened to me if I didn't have access to this program. That's how bad the situation is nowadays. It's very difficult to find a job with all the violence and crime happening out there. This is a very good opportunity for me to do something I like.
The project was launched by the Salvadorian Association for Development, by the Women for Dignity Association, and other feminist collectives. This project is being carried out in Chalatenango, La Libertad, La Paz, and Usulután, where more than 4,000 kids have benefited from it.
This is a space where they can be free because they are safe. We believe that this helps preventing violence, which is a very important issue in our country. We know that kids are the most vulnerable, especially in the outskirts of towns.
A research done in 12 municipalities of the country showed that the main cause of violence against young people is the stigmatization against them, especially against women.
Young people feel that they are even more exposed just because being young. Being a girl is another issue. It doubles the risk, since we live in a patriarchal society where violence against women is prevalent.
Youth in Action gives young people the opportunity to get access to education, employment, and health, but most of all, security, since only in 2019, 8 homicides happen each day in El Salvador.
The prosecutor's office in Peru has gathered key information on corruption cases linked to the Brazilian construction company Odebrecht. The probe shows that at least 36 officials from previous governments are involved in a bribing scheme.
After a week of questioning, members of the prosecution were able to gather more information regarding different corruption cases involving the Brazilian construction company Odebrecht and its projects in Peru. Investigators were able to determine that Odebrecht bribes for the construction of a highway were not only paid to former President Alejandro Toledo.
We know that the Brazilian company paid $20 million to Toledo. What we didn't know is that the bribes reached $45 million. So this is one of the many revelations of this investigation. Toledo will have to explain this. He'll have to explain if there are any other bribe payments and who were paid.
36 former officials from the government of Alejandro Toledo and former President Alan Garcia are involved in this corruption case. Investigations show that Odebrecht created a complex system not to leave any evidence of the bribe, using the company's Peruvian businessman Gonzalo Monteverde as a cover.
The money went to Monteverde's account and then transferred to other offshore company accounts. This was created to hide who were really benefiting from these payments. The money was transferred and then was moved to other accounts.
According to investigator Francisco Durand, the Peruvian state has been doing this for 25 years, not only with Odebrecht, but a large part of the country's business sector.
They simulated they were competing for state projects. Once they were working on a project, they increased their budgets and there were no controls over this. They paid the state a bribe that ended up in an offshore company contract. This repeated government after government for years.
Investigations will continue in March with the questioning of Odebrecht's former chief in Peru, Jorge Barata. He has been singled out as the one responsible for creating this corruption scheme that has involved the latest governments, the judiciary, and media corporations.
The United States Health Department has received more than 4,500 complaints of sexual abuse against migrant children detained at the U.S.-Mexico border. The complaints were made between 2014 and 2018. The Department of Justice reportedly received more than 1,300 additional complaints of sexual abuse against unaccompanied minors during the same period. Most of the complaints were against independent child care service centers that are contracted by state officials. Trade unions in Guyana are prepared to put a fight on behalf of workers fired from the Russian aluminum company. The workers were fired because they held a strike calling for a 1% increase in pay. The unions have promised to keep a close eye on the situation so other offshore companies don't begin treating their workers unfairly. And as we mentioned earlier, Venezuelan opposition figure Juan Guaidó is set to arrive in Brazil tonight for meetings with President Jair Bolsonaro. Our correspondent in Sao Paulo, Brian Meir, has the story.
I'm in Sao Paulo, where at 10 o'clock tonight, Juan Guaidó is expected to arrive from Colombia on a flight for meetings with Brazilian President Jair Bolsonaro to talk about a possible plan of action for renewed aggressions against the democratically elected government of Venezuela. Now, some people are questioning his judgment and even wanting to meet with Bolsonaro because Bolsonaro was unable to establish consensus within his own ruling coalition to support Donald Trump's so-called humanitarian move on Saturday, February 23rd against the government of Venezuela. Apparently, according to Folha do São Paulo newspaper, many of Bolsonaro's top generals, as well as House Speaker Rodrigo Maia, spoke out against any participation in the initiative, and that's why the government only sent 2 pickup trucks with a small amount of supplies on them to partake in this, what appeared to be a publicity stunt that was held on the Brazilian border with Venezuela. So Guaidó is arriving. There's going to be a lot of media attention for it, but will there be any concrete results? General Hamilton Mourão, Vice President of Brazil, said the day before yesterday in Colombia that Brazil will not allow the U.S. military to use its territory to launch any kind of military attack against Venezuela, and Brazil will also refuse to engage in these kinds of attacks.
That was Brian Meir from Sao Paulo. More news now. A Brazilian architect is promoting a biodegradable glitter to ease on the amount of plastic waste generated during Carnival. Frances Sansal has created a glitter made out of seaweed and mica stone powder. Unlike plastic glitter, this one decomposes when washed off and won't end up in the stomach of marine fauna.
I love Carnival, but it generates a lot of trash. People use a lot of disposable cups. They throw a lot of things on the street, like litter, customs. People buy a lot of customs made of plastic because it's cheap. Our consumption culture during Carnival is really not environmentally friendly.
We'll be back very soon. Stay with us. Welcome back. The confrontation between Pakistan and India over Kashmir has escalated dramatically. Both sides now say they've shot down each other's warplanes. Pakistan says it downed 2 Indian jets in its airspace and one of its pilots, while India confirms the loss of one of its planes and says it shot down a Pakistani fighter jet. In response to the violence, Pakistan has closed its airspace until further notice. At least 6 airports were shuttered in India. Pakistan's Prime Minister is now calling for talks. Tensions between the two countries have been high since the February 14th suicide bombing in Kashmir that killed 40 Indian troops. On Tuesday, India warplanes responded by flying into Pakistani airspace and striking a camp of Jaish-e-Mohammed, the group that claimed the Kashmir bombing. It was India's first airstrike in Pakistan since 1971. Earlier, we spoke with Telesur's political analyst Tariq Ali about the rising tensions between India and Pakistan.
But in Kashmir as a whole, I would say that between 70 to 80% of the population is hostile to the way in which India has been governing and ruling this province from 1948 onwards. This has escalated now into a full-blown conflict. And the fact that one of the BJP leaders has said we should boycott Kashmiri goods indicates that they don't regard Kashmir as part of India. Otherwise, why make such a stupid remark if you think that Kashmir is a sovereign part of India? So it's a crisis that is refusing to go away, and there are possible solutions, but the Indians, who are the main party in the dispute, are refusing to budge. And within India itself, within Indian civil society, there is very little support for the Kashmiris.
Nigerians in Abuja are reacting to President Muhammadu Buhari's election win. Some expressed satisfaction with how the election was run. However, some still maintain the polls were not free or fair. Buhari won with 56% of the vote against his main rival, Antigua and Barbuda, of the People's Democratic Party. Hours after Buhari was declared the winner, Abubakar rejected the result and vowed to challenge it in court.
I'm happy that Buhari win the seat back as our new president, because what he's doing, you understand me, he's doing something that will be happy, because people did not understand what the man wants to do, because he have a future, and he have future for Nigeria. Even for we youth, we Yoruba, we are very happy that Buhari win the seat.
Me as a person, I'm not happy. Even Nigeria in general, we are not happy because of the election. But what we need peace in Nigeria. So what we need, we should advise Atiku to go to court if there's we can challenge, if there's any evidence.
Israeli forces have arrested a senior Fatah member and 33 other Palestinians during multiple raids across the occupied West Bank and East Jerusalem. According to the Palestine Prisoner Society, Zakaria Zubayd was arrested alongside his lawyer. Zubaydi was a leading member of Fatah's armed wing, but was later given amnesty by Israel in a deal reached with the Palestinian Authority. Israeli forces frequently raid Palestinian houses across the West Bank on the pretext of searching for wanted Palestinians. U.S. President Donald Trump's former personal attorney Michael Cohen has called his former boss a racist and a con man. Cohen made those remarks while testifying before the U.S. Congress. He also revealed how Trump instructed him to lie about a lucrative real estate project he had in the works in Russia while he was running for president.
To know that Mr. Trump's personal lawyers reviewed and edited my statement to Congress about the timing of the Moscow Tower negotiations before I gave it. So to be clear, Mr. Trump knew of and directed the Trump-Moscow negotiations throughout the campaign and lied about it. He lied about it because he never expected to win.
And with that, we've come to the end of this news brief. These and other stories, as always, find them on our website at telesurenglish.net. And also join us on social media. We are on Facebook, on Twitter, and on Instagram. For Telesur English, I am Stefania Bravo. Thank you for watching.